There's something unnerving about the desert at dusk. The way the light fades faster than in any other place, swallowed by an endless horizon that blurs into the sky, giving everything an ethereal, lifeless quality. The desert had always felt like a place where the world stopped caring, and for the Hanson family, it would be the last place where the world would stop noticing they ever existed. It was late May, and the Hansons, Mark, 43, Lisa, 36, their teenage daughter Emily, 14, and their young son Jake, 8, were on what was supposed to be a relaxing road trip across the western United States. Mark had taken some time off from work at the construction company, while Lisa had packed their SUV with snacks, pillows, and the hope that the trip might bring them closer as a family. Emily had been distant lately, caught up in the turmoil of adolescence, while Jake, always restless, was itching for an adventure. They planned to visit national parks, stopping at odd roadside attractions along the way. It was a well-earned break from the monotony of suburban life. But things didn't go as planned. It was the third day of their trip when they found themselves on Route 27, a nameless, forgotten highway in the heart of an unnamed desert state. It wasn't a part of their original route, but a detour had forced them to take this stretch of road, where there were no towns, no gas stations, and hardly any signs of life. The desert landscape stretched endlessly in every direction, with only a jagged mountain range to the far east breaking the monotony. The first sign of trouble came as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The temperature was dropping fast, and the faint hum of the SUV's engine began to sputter. Mark furrowed his brow, tapping the gas pedal as the car jerked forward in fits. "Something's wrong," he muttered under his breath. He pulled over to the side of the road, where the gravel crunched beneath the tires. "We can't be out of gas already, can we?" Lisa asked, glancing anxiously at the gauge. "No, we've still got a quarter tank," Mark replied. He opened the driver's side door and stepped out, walking to the front of the vehicle. The heat of the desert pavement radiated through the soles of his boots, but there was something else, a sense of isolation that crept into his bones. As Mark fiddled with the engine, Emily sat in the back seat, her eyes glued to her phone. She had barely spoken a word to her parents since they'd left home. Jake, meanwhile, was dozing in the seat beside her, clutching his stuffed bear, oblivious to the growing tension. After what felt like an eternity, Mark slammed the hood shut and returned to the driver's seat. "It's not the engine. We're just stuck," he said, shaking his head. "Stuck?" Lisa's voice wavered. "What does that even mean? We're in the middle of nowhere." "I don't know. I'll try the emergency number." He reached for his phone, but there was no signal. Of course, there wouldn't be, not out here. They were too far from civilization. The sun was setting quickly now, the sky above them deepening from orange to violet. Shadows lengthened across the cracked earth, and the desert seemed to grow more silent with every passing minute. It was an oppressive silence, the kind that pressed in on all sides and made you feel smaller, insignificant. And then, in the distance, headlights appeared. A truck. Large, old, and rumbling along the deserted highway. It slowed as it approached their stalled SUV, its beams cutting through the encroaching darkness. Relief washed over Mark. "Help, finally." The truck rolled to a stop a few yards behind them. 4 men got out, their silhouettes looming in the twilight. They looked rough, weathered by the desert, with sunburnt skin and dusty clothes that suggested they hadn't been near civilization in some time. One of them, a tall man with a shaved head and a grim expression, took the lead. "You folks having some trouble?" he called out, his voice gravelly but calm. "Yeah," Mark said, forcing a polite smile. "Car broke down. Not sure what the problem is. Mind giving us a hand?" The bald man exchanged a glance with the others, who fanned out around the truck. There was something off about them, though Mark couldn't place it. The way they moved, too casual, too confident, made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. But he pushed the feeling aside. This was the desert. People here were different, rougher around the edges. The man approached the SUV, looking it over. "Doesn't look too bad," he said, but there was no real interest in his voice. He glanced over at Mark, then let his eyes drift toward the rest of the family. Mind if we take a closer look? Mark hesitated. Sure, I guess. That's when everything changed. In one fluid motion, the bald man grabbed Mark by the collar, slamming him against the side of the SUV. Before Lisa could react, one of the other men was pulling her out of the passenger seat, his filthy hand covering her mouth. Emily screamed, but her voice was cut off by another of the men grabbing her by the arm, dragging her from the back seat. Mark struggled, gasping for air as the bald man tightened his grip. "We're gonna have ourselves a little fun," the man growled, his voice dripping with malice. He punched Mark in the gut, sending him crumpling to the ground. Jake woke up, disoriented and terrified. "Dad!" "Mom!" he screamed, but his small voice was lost in the chaos. Lisa fought with everything she had, kicking and scratching, but her attacker was stronger, relentless. Emily, tears streaming down her face, tried to run, but the man who held her dragged her back, forcing her to the ground. Mark, barely able to stand, watched in horror as the men overpowered his wife and daughter. His head was spinning, pain radiating through his chest. He tried to get up, but the bald man kicked him again, harder this time. "Stay down," he spat. "You're gonna watch." Hours passed, though it felt like days in the crushing blackness of the desert night. The men tortured and violated the family, taking pleasure in their suffering, laughing at their cries for mercy. The desert, once serene and indifferent, had become a prison, a hellscape where time seemed to stretch endlessly. By the time the sun began to rise, casting the landscape in pale light, the family lay broken, battered, and bloodied. The men, having gotten their fill, stood over them, sharing a few cruel jokes before disappearing into the distance. The truck's engine roared to life, and soon, the desert was silent again. Emily awoke hours later, her body bruised and aching. The world around her was a blur of sand, sky, and sun, blinding, oppressive. Her family was gone, their bodies removed, but she could still feel their presence in the air, their final screams echoing in the back of her mind. Her mouth was dry, her throat raw from crying out in the night. She had no idea how long she had been unconscious, how far the men had dragged her away from the road. The sun bore down on her mercilessly, and she could feel her skin burning. She tried to stand, but her legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed back onto the hot sand. Panic set in. There was nothing around her but miles of desert in every direction. No shade, no water, no road in sight. She was alone. Emily crawled, her fingers digging into the sand, her body trembling with exhaustion and dehydration. She tried to scream, but her voice was little more than a hoarse whisper, lost in the vast emptiness of the desert. The heat grew unbearable, her vision blurring as the world around her became a distorted haze. She thought she saw shadows on the horizon, figures moving toward her, but it was only a mirage, the cruel tricks of the desert playing on her failing mind. She collapsed once more, her face pressed against the scorching earth. In her final moments of consciousness, she thought of her family, her father's laugh, her mother's soft touch, Jake's bright smile. She had lost them, and now, the desert would take her too. Emily's body was never found. The desert had claimed its victims, as it always does, silently, without mercy. The men who had terrorized the Hanson family were never caught, never even suspected. To the world, the Hansons simply vanished, swallowed by the desolation of Route 27. And the desert, indifferent as ever, continued to stretch on for miles, forever hiding its darkest secrets beneath the shifting sands.